In the autumn of 1887, in the timber country above the Clark Fork River in western Montana Territory, a girl of 19 stood at the edge of a clearing she had bought for $2 and looked at the ruin she now owned. The sawmill had not run in 11 years. Its roof had fallen in 3 places. The carriage rails were red with rust, and the great circular blade at its heart was buried to the spine in rotted sawdust and the silt of 100 spring floods. The men who sold it to her had laughed when she counted out the coins. They told her she had bought a graveyard for machines and that she would not get a single board out of it before the snow came. She did not answer them. She had learned long ago that a quiet hand outlasts a loud mouth, and that the things a town throws away are sometimes the only things worth keeping. Her name was Cora Vane, and 4 days earlier her stepfather had set her trunk on the porch and told her there was no longer room for her under his roof. She had no money beyond the $11 sewn into the hem of her coat, no family who would claim her, and no trade the town considered fit for a woman. What she had instead was a memory of sawdust and the smell of cut pine, and a pair of hands that knew how to read a saw the way other people read scripture. That memory in those hands would prove worth more than the whole town guessed. Yet I am getting ahead of the story, and a story like this one deserves to be told slowly, the way the work itself was done. If you have ever been counted as nothing by people who never bothered to look closely, stay with this one. You will want to see how it ends. To understand why a girl would pay even $2 for a dead mill, you have to understand the man who taught her. His name was Elias Tate, and he had been the sawyer at the Bitterroot Mill for 30 years before his lungs gave out under the weight of a lifetime of pine dust. Cora's mother had cooked for the mill crew, 16 hungry men, twice a day, and from the time the girl could walk, she had spent her days in the shadow of the blade, where Elias let her sweep the floor for a penny a week. Later, he let her sharpen the small tools, the froes and the marking knives, and watched her do it without saying much. And later still, when he saw she had the patience for it, he taught her to set the teeth of the saws with a hammer he had ground down on the grindstone to fit her smaller grip. He was a hard man with a soft patience for anyone willing to learn, and a short way with anyone who was not. He did not waste words, and the words he did spend he meant. "A saw does not lie," he told her once, when she had hammered a tooth crooked and tried to hide the fault under a smear of pitch so he would not see it. He had seen it at once. "Wood will tell you the truth the moment you start the cut," he said. "It will pull to the weak side and char where the set is wrong, and then everyone will know what you tried to hide. Learn to listen before the wood has to teach you the hard way." She had been 12 then, standing in the sawdust with the crooked tooth between them, and she had carried that sentence in her like a coal ever since. Elias had died the winter Cora turned 17, coughing into a rag in a borrowed bed, and he had left her 2 things. The first was a canvas roll of saw tools, the swage and the gauge, and the hammer ground to her hand, that she kept wrapped at the bottom of her trunk. The second was a way of seeing. Where other people saw a rusted hulk, fit only for scrap, Cora had been taught to see the bones of a thing, to judge whether the iron beneath the ruin was sound or rotten clear through. That seeing was the only inheritance she had, and it was the reason she had walked 4 miles out of town to look at the dead mill on the Vane clearing in the first place. The mill had belonged, long ago, to a company called Harmon Brothers Lumber, and the name still meant something in that part of the territory. Silas Harmon had grown rich on Montana timber, and he sat now in a stone house in Missoula with a bank that carried his name on the door. People spoke of him the way they spoke of weather, as a force that arrived and took what it wanted and left you to account for the damage. The dead mill above the Clark Fork was a thing the Harmon Company had abandoned a decade before, and no one in town could say exactly why a working mill had been shut in a single season and left to rot. They only knew that the men who had worked it had scattered, and that the one man who might have explained it, the old foreman, had drowned in the river the same autumn The saw went quiet. Cora knew none of that yet. She knew only that the iron carriage rails under the rust had the deep solid ring of good steel when she struck them with a stone, and that a blade buried in sawdust is a blade protected from the weather, not destroyed by it. So she had gone to the county clerk, and she had learned that the parcel had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes, and that it would be sold at the courthouse steps for whatever it brought. It brought $2 because she was the only bidder who showed, and because the clerk wanted to be rid of a thing no one else would touch. The auctioneer made his joke about the graveyard for machines, and the 3 men who had come to watch laughed along with him. One of them, a freighter named Pruitt with a red face and a louder opinion than his sense warranted, told her she would do better to sell the iron for scrap and the lumber rights to a real outfit. A girl alone could not run a mill, he said, loud enough for the whole courthouse step to hear, and even a man would think twice about that one. The auctioneer told her the nearest sawyer who might hire on was 40 miles off and would laugh her out of his yard. Cora folded the deed and put it inside her coat against the $11 in the hem. She thanked the clerk in a level voice, and she walked out past the laughing men, and she did not give Pruitt the argument he was fishing for. She had learned that an argument is a thing you can lose, and that work is a thing that only answers to the doing of it. The deed was signed, the rest was only work, and work did not care what Pruitt thought of her. She made her camp in the soundest corner of the mill, where the roof still held and the wind off the river did not reach, and she spent the first day simply looking. This is the part the town never understood, and the part Elias would have approved of most. She did not lift a tool for a full day. She walked the structure end to end and read it the way she had been taught to read a log before the saw touched it. She rapped the posts with a stone and listened for the dull note that means rot and the hard note that means sound timber, and she found more sound than rotten. She found that the main shaft was true with no visible bow along its length, and that the great drive wheel turned, stiff with rust, but not seized, when she threw her whole weight against a spoke and felt it grudgingly give. She found that the carriage, the wheeled bed that fed a log into the blade, still rolled on its rails when she cleared the worst of the debris from the track and leaned into it. And she found at the heart of the building the circular saw itself, a disk of steel some 4 feet across, its teeth furred with rust, but its body, when she scraped a patch clean with sand and a wet rag, sound and bright and unpitted underneath. A blade, like that, new, cost more than she would see in a year. The town had walked past it for 11 years and called it a graveyard. The blade was buried in a packed mound of rotted sawdust and river silt that had washed in through the broken wall over 11 flood seasons. To free it, she would have to dig. And digging is the most honest work there is because the ground does not care who you are. She dug for 3 days. She dug with a shovel she had bought for a dime, its handle cracked and bound with wire, and a flour sack she filled and dragged and emptied at the broken wall again and again until her palms blistered and the blisters broke and wept and dried and healed into something harder. The sawdust near the surface was light and gray, and came away in dusty shovelfuls that hung in the cold air. Deeper down it was black and wet and heavy as clay, packed by the floods into a thing that fought the blade of the shovel and gave up its ground a handful at a time. She worked from first light until she could no longer see the iron she was uncovering. On the first day she cleared the floor around the carriage and found the rails sound. On the second day she reached the lower curve of the blade and the iron collar that held it to the shaft, furred with rust but whole, and she found the bolts she would have to coax loose one at a time, each one a small argument between her wrench and 11 years of weather. She soaked them in coal oil she could barely afford and left them to drink overnight. And on the third day, near the base of the blade where the silt was packed hardest and blackest, her shovel struck something that was not iron and was not stone. It rang wrong. The shovel had learned the sound of the rails and the sound of the river rock, and this was neither. She set the shovel aside and went down on her knees in the cold, wet sawdust, and dug with her hands. What she found the first time was a corner of wood. Not the soft rotted pine of the mill, but a hard, dark oak, plain smooth, and joined with a craftsman's care, the corner of a box that had been set into the ground beneath the blade and packed over with sawdust so deliberately that no flood would ever shift it. Her heart went very still, the way Elias had taught her a hand should go still before a difficult cut, when the worst thing you can do is hurry. She did not tear at it. She cleared the sawdust away from the whole top of the box, working outward from the corner with her fingers, brushing the black silt aside until she could see the shape of it. It was a chest perhaps 2 feet long, banded in iron at the corners, its lid sealed with a hasp and a lock gone solid with rust. Someone had buried it deep and buried it level, and packed it round with the one material a sawmill makes in endless supply, so that it lay under the heart of the machine like a secret kept inside a sleeping thing. She did not open it that day. The light was failing, and her hands shook from the cold and from the digging, and a thing buried with that much care deserved to be opened in the full light of morning, with a steady hand and clear eyes. She covered it again loosely against the night, and slept beside it on the mill floor, and she lay awake a long time listening to the river run past in the dark, and wondering what a man would hide beneath the blade of his own mill, and what it had cost him to do it. Here is something worth saying. Before the box is opened, a buried thing is a kind of message sent forward through time by someone who could not say it aloud while they lived. The question is never only what is in the box. The question is who put it there, and what they were so afraid of that they trusted the truth to the dark and the iron instead of to another living soul. In the morning she opened it. The lock would not turn, so she did not fight it. She worked the hasp loose from the wood with patience and a thin blade until the whole fitting came away clean. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a ledger. It was a company ledger, bound in board and leather, the kind every lumber outfit kept, and at first she thought it was only that, a record of board feet and wages that someone had hidden out of some private grievance. She turned the stiff pages carefully, and they were what she had expected, columns of figures in a clerk's hand, tallies of logs, scaled and boards cut, and men paid by the day, the dull arithmetic of a working mill. The grievance, if there was one, was not in the numbers. Then her thumb found a thickness in the front cover where the leather had been slit and re-sewn, and she understood that the ledger was not the message. It was only the wrapping around it. Folded inside the front cover were other papers, and the papers were what mattered. She drew them out one at a time, smoothing each against her knee. They were deeds. There were 3 deeds to timber parcels along the upper Clark Fork, made out not to Harmon Brothers Lumber, but to 3 separate families, signed and witnessed and stamped with the wax and ink of the Territorial Land Office, dated in the years before the company had ever claimed that ground. She read the names slowly, the way Elias had taught her to read a grain before the cut, and she felt the cold of the morning settle into something colder. And folded beneath the deeds was a letter, 4 pages, in a careful, deliberate hand, that named those families and said what had been done to them. Cora read the letter twice, sitting on the floor of the mill with the morning light coming through the broken roof, and when she had finished it, she understood why a working mill had been shut in a single season and left to rot, and why the old foreman had drowned, and why the box had been buried with the care of a man who knew he was running out of time. The letter was written by the foreman, a man named Joseph Reed, in the autumn of 1876. He wrote that Silas Harmon had built his company on stolen ground. 3 homestead families had proved up their claims on the timberland along the river, the Doyles, the Mercers, and a Salish family. The letter named only as the household of Marie Standing Elk, and Harmon had wanted that timber. He had not bought it. He had gone to the land office with a clerk in his pay, and had the original entries altered and the family's deeds reported lost. and then he had filed his own claims over the top of theirs and run the families off with hired men and the threat of law that he owned. Reed had been the foreman who carried out the orders, and Reed had kept the true deeds, the ones Harmon believed destroyed, because some part of him had known from the start that he was helping to commit a theft he would answer for. When his conscience finally turned, Reed had threatened to take the deeds to the territorial court and undo what he had helped to do. And within the month the mill was closed. Without warning, the crew paid off and scattered to other camps before they could ask why, and Joseph Reed was found face down in the Clark Fork below the mill race with no mark on him that anyone would swear to. The county called it an accident, a man who had drunk too much and slipped on the wet rock, and no one, with the standing to question it, asked a single question. Reed, before he died, knowing what was coming for him, had buried the truth beneath the one thing he was certain no one would ever trouble to dig out. The blade of a dead mill he had already arranged to have shut, and he had trusted that someday the right hands would find what his own hands had hidden. The right hands had taken 11 years to arrive, and they belonged to a girl the town had thrown away. Cora sat with that knowledge for a long while. She was 19 and alone and possessed of $11 and a deed to a ruin, and she now held in her lap the proof that the richest man in the county was a thief and very possibly a murderer. A lesser inheritance than Elias Tate's seeing might have told her to bury the box again and keep her head down. Yet she had been taught that the wood tells the truth the moment you start the cut, and she had started the cut now, and there was no unsaying it. She did not run to the sheriff. This is important, and it is the difference between a story about vengeance and a story about something harder and better. Cora understood, young as she was, that the proof in her lap was worth nothing if it could be made to disappear the way Joseph Reed had disappeared. Silas Harmon had altered records once and could do it again. A girl walking into a courthouse with a foreman's letter and 3 deeds would be a girl walking into a room Harmon owned. So she did what the dead foreman had done. She made the truth bigger than any one room. First, though, she needed to know the families were real and that some of them remained. So she folded the deeds back into the oilcloth and hid them where she had found them beneath the blade, because the safest place for a secret is sometimes the place it was already safe. And she set out to find the people whose names she now carried. The first name she ran down was Mercer. She found a Tom Mercer running a livery stable 2 days' ride south, a man near 50 with a bad hip and hands stained dark from harness leather, and a memory that turned hard and bright the moment she said the word timber. He had been forking hay when she came into the barn, and he stopped with the fork half raised and looked at her the way a man looks at weather coming. His father had filed on that land, he told her, and they had been driven off it when Tom was a boy of 9. He remembered the day. He remembered the men who came with the paper that said the deed was lost, and the rifle one of them carried across his saddle, though no shot was ever fired, and his father, standing in the yard with the false paper in his hand and no way to read past the words that were stealing his life. His father had died swearing the deed had been real and the loss a swindle, and no one in 40 years had ever believed him. Cora did not show Tom the deed, not yet. She had been taught that you do not show your hand before you have read the whole grain. She only asked him to describe the parcel, the bend of the river, the lay of the ground, and Tom set down the fork and described it like a man reciting a prayer he had said every night since childhood. There was a stand of larch on the high ground, he said, that his father had meant to leave standing because it held the hill against the spring runoff. There was a spring that came out of the rock cold even in August. When his description matched the deed in every particular, the larch and the spring and the bend of the river, all where the paper said they were, she knew the letter had told the truth. She told Tom only that she had found something, and that he should be ready to come to the county seat when she sent word. He looked at her a long time, this girl in a worn coat with sawdust still in the seams of it, and something in her steadiness made him nod. "I have waited 40 years, he said. I can wait a little longer, if you tell me the waiting will end." The Doyles were harder. The family had gone north after the eviction. Scattered the way frontier families scatter when the ground is pulled out from under them, and the trail ran cold, and Cora spent 4 days she could not afford asking after them in towns where no one knew her and no one had reason to help a stranger in a worn coat. She found at last a married daughter, Annie Doyle, that was, now, Annie Cobb, keeping house above a dry goods store in a rail town 2 valleys over. Annie was hanging wash on a line strung across the back stair when Cora found her, and she went still with the wet sheet in her hands when the old names were spoken. She remembered the eviction the way you remember a house fire. She said in flashes of heat and noise and her mother's voice. And she remembered her father's deed folded in the family Bible, and she remembered the name Harmon spoken in her household ever after the way other families spoke of the angel of death. Her father had gone to his grave, certain he had been robbed and certain no one would ever prove it. Cora gave Annie the same instruction she had given Tom Mercer. "Be ready. Come when I send word." Annie pinned the sheet to the line with hands that were not quite steady, and said she would come if she had to walk. The household of Marie Standing Elk was the hardest of all, and here Cora moved most carefully, because she knew the law of the territory had been built to take exactly this kind of ground, and had no intention of giving it back. She found, through a trader on the Jocko who knew the Salish families along the river, that Marie Standing Elk had died years before, worn out before her time, but that her daughter lived, a woman named Susanna, who had married into a family near the agency. Cora rode 2 days to the Jocko Valley and sat in Susanna's kitchen and drank the tea she was offered, and explained, plainly and without ornament, what she had found buried beneath a sawmill blade. Susanna heard her out without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her face giving nothing away. Then she said a thing Cora never forgot. "My mother said the paper was real," she said, "and they told her a woman like her could not own land, and that the paper meant nothing because of what she was. Now a girl like you comes to my table to tell me the paper was real all along." Cora said that the paper was real, and that it bore the Territorial Land Office's own stamp, and that she meant to put it in front of people who could not make it disappear. She said Susanna's name, her mother's name, was written on it in the office's own ink. Susanna looked out the window a long while at the ground that had been taken from her family, and then she said she would come. While she searched, Cora did not let the mill sit idle, and this is the part Elias would have loved best. She had a deed to a ruin and a winter coming, and a person cannot eat proof. So, in the hours she was not on the road, she returned to the mill, and she made it run. She freed the blade from its collar, easing the last bolts loose with the coal oil and the wrench, and a patience that did not hurry the iron, and she took the great disc down and laid it flat on a bed of clean planks. Then she went over every tooth with the swage and the gauge and the hammer ground to her hand, the way Elias had taught her. She set each tooth to the same fine angle, checking the spread against the gauge, listening for the change in the ring of the steel as the rust came off, and the true metal sang underneath. It took her 4 days. When she was done, the blade rang clean. When she flicked it with a fingernail, a long, bright note that held in the air, and she knew before she ever cut a board that it would run true. She cleared the drive wheel of 11 years of debris and greased the shaft with tallow she rendered herself, working the grease into the bearings until the wheel turned without complaint. She rigged a belt from the old leather she found rolled in a dry corner of the loft, stiff as board, and she worked neatsfoot oil into it for 2 evenings until it was supple enough to splice. She walked the mill race from the river to the wheel pit, and found it choked with silt and a fallen alder, and she cleared it the way she had cleared the blade, a handful and an hour at a time. She dammed the race and cleared the sluice and rebuilt the gate from sound planks she cut by hand. And on a cold, bright morning in the 3rd week, she let the water back into the wheel pit, one careful turn of the gate at a time, watching the great wheel take the weight of the water, and she pulled the lever, and the wheel turned, and the shaft turned, and the blade she had raised from the dead spun up to speed with a sound like a held note. She cut her first board that morning, a clean plank off a fallen larch she had bucked to length the day before. The blade took the wood without a shudder, the way good steel takes wood when the set is true, and the board fell away, square and bright and smelling of pitch. She stood holding it in the sawdust and the steam of her own breath, and the sound she had brought back to that clearing was the sound of being right when everyone had told her she was a fool. Word travels in timber country. Within a fortnight, the men who had laughed at the courthouse heard that the dead mill above the Clark Fork was running, and that the girl who bought it for $2 was selling cut lumber to a homesteader downriver at a fair price and getting more orders than she could fill. Pruitt, the freighter, rode out to see it for himself, and he sat his horse at the edge of the clearing and watched the blade throw its bright arc of sawdust, and he did not say anything clever. He had hauled freight past that ruin for 11 years and had never once thought to wonder what it might be worth in the right hands. That alone would have been a fine story, the dismissed girl who made the dead mill sing. Cora, though, had not forgotten the box, and the box was the real cut, the one that would tell the truth the moment she started it. She chose the day with care. The territorial court sat in the county seat 4 times a year, and a circuit judge came through who did not live in the county and owed Silas Harmon nothing. She sent her word to the 3 families, Tom Mercer and Annie Cobb and Susanna of the Jocko, and she asked the county clerk, who had sold her the mill, the one man in that courthouse she judged honest, to enter into the record 3 deeds and a letter on the morning the circuit judge sat. She did not accuse. She had been taught that an accusation is only noise, and that the wood tells the truth on its own. She simply asked that the original deeds, stamped by the Territorial Land Office, be compared against the claims on file under the name of Harmon Brothers Lumber. The clerk, a careful man named Bell, took the deeds and held them to the window light, and saw the territorial stamp pressed deep into the paper and the dates that came years before Harmon's filings. And his face changed, by degrees, the way a man's face changes when the floor he has stood on for years tilts under him. He had spent a decade certifying the Harmon claims without ever knowing the ground beneath them was stolen. He set the deeds down on his desk and smoothed them flat with both hands, very gently, as though they might tear. He asked Cora where she had found the papers. She told him the truth, that they had been buried in an iron-banded chest under the blade of the old mill above the Clark Fork, set there by the foreman, Joseph Reed, before he drowned. Bell was quiet for a long moment, and the only sound in the office was the scratch of a fly against the window glass. Then he said that he had been a young clerk the autumn Reed died, new to the office and eager to please, and that he had always thought there was something wrong in how fast that mill went quiet and how little anyone was permitted to ask about it. He said he had carried the wrongness like a stone for 11 years without ever having a name for it. Now he had the name. He told her he would enter the deeds into the record, himself in his own hand, before the circuit judge, and that, once they were entered, no man alive could pull them back out. There was no confrontation. This is the truth of how such things fall, when they fall at all. Silas Harmon was not dragged from his stone house. He was not met on the courthouse steps by an avenging girl with a letter in her fist. What happened was quieter and heavier than that. The deeds went into the record, witnessed, with the 3 families standing in the courtroom to claim them, and once a thing is in the territorial record, with a circuit judge presiding, it cannot be made to vanish the way a single foreman can be made to vanish in a river. The judge ordered the original claims investigated. The land office in Helena, fearing its own clerks would be found to have taken Harmon's money, moved faster than anyone expected to disown the altered entries and protect itself. And Silas Harmon, who had built an empire on the certainty that paper would always do what he told it, found that the paper had at last told the truth, and that there was nothing he could threaten or buy that would put it back in the ground. He did not stand trial in the way the families might have wished. Men like Harmon rarely do. Even so, the timber parcels along the Upper Clark Fork were restored to the Mercers and the Doyles, and to Susanna and her people. The value of 11 years of stolen lumber was charged against the Harmon Company in a judgment that broke its back, and the bank with his name on the door in Missoula closed within the year. He left the territory before the second snow. The town that had spoken his name like weather stopped speaking it at all, which is its own kind of justice, the dissolving of a man into the silence he had made for others. Cora took nothing from the judgment. The families offered her a share, and she refused it, because the deeds had never been hers, and the lumber had never been hers, and a thing restored is not a thing to be skimmed. What she kept was the mill, which had been hers honestly for $2, and the trade which had been hers since she was 12 years old in the shadow of the bitterroot blade. That was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Tom Mercer came back to his father's land and built a house on the high ground among the larch his father had described to a stranger in a livery stable. Annie Cobb's husband took up the timber rights, and Annie wrote Cora a letter once a year for the rest of her life. Susanna of the Jocko stood on ground that bore her mother's name in the territorial record at last, and she sent Cora that first spring a basket woven so tight it held water, and Cora kept it on the shelf above her workbench until the day she died. The men who had laughed at the courthouse did not, most of them, ever say they were sorry. That is not how it goes. Pruitt, the freighter, though, began hauling Cora's lumber to the towns downriver, and he charged her an honest rate, and once, years later, when a newcomer at a saloon made a joke about a woman trying to run a mill, it was Pruitt who set down his glass and said the girl had pulled a working mill out of a graveyard with her own 2 hands, and found a truth buried 11 years that broke the richest man in the county, and that the newcomer should learn the country before he opened his mouth in it. A grudging conversion is still a conversion. The work had said what Cora never would. She ran the mill on the Clark Fork for 41 years. The blade she had raised from beneath the silt-cut timber for the houses and the barns and the bridges of 3 valleys, and she trained sawyers the way Elias had trained her, hard and patient, and to each one she gave the same first lesson before she let them near the saw. "Saw does not lie," she told them. "The wood will tell you the truth the moment you start the cut. Learn to listen before the wood has to teach you the hard way." Some of them understood her right away. Most of them learned it the way she had, slowly with blistered hands. She never married, and she was never lonely in the way the town had predicted for a girl alone, because she had the mill and the families who came back every spring, and the long satisfaction of a thing done right. When people asked her, late in her life, how a girl of 19 had known to dig under the blade, she always gave the same answer, which was no answer at all, and the truest thing she knew. She said she had been taught to see the bones of a thing. She said the man who taught her had told her that what a town throws away is sometimes the only thing worth keeping, and that she had believed him, and that it had turned out to be so. The canvas roll of tools Elias left her hung on a peg by the door of the mill for all 41 years, the swage, the gauge, the hammer, ground down to fit a smaller grip. She used them every working day and oiled them every winter, and they outlasted 3 other sets. She bought new. When Cora was old and her own hands had gone stiff, the way his had, a young woman came up the road from town one spring with no family that would claim her, and no trade the town thought fit, footsore and quiet and watchful, and asked if there was work. Cora looked at her a long moment, the way Tom Mercer had once looked at Cora across a livery barn. Then she took the hammer down from the peg, the one ground to a smaller grip, and she weighed it once in her own stiff hand, and she put it in the girl's hand, and she said it was about the right size, and that they would start in the morning, and that the first thing to learn was how to listen. Outside, the water ran in the mill race, and the great wheel turned, and the blade that the town had left for dead spun up to speed with a sound like a held note, the same note it had made the first cold morning a cast-out girl of 19 brought it back to life. The sound carried down the clearing and into the trees, and it was, if you knew how to hear it, the sound of the truth being told. What would you have done, alone at 19, with that box in your lap and the richest man in the county on the other side of the proof? Sit with that a moment. And if a story of a dismissed soul who turned a thing the world threw away into the truth that set it right is the kind of story that stays with you, there is another like it waiting, about a different ruin and a different pair of patient hands.